So, okay, so the two different approaches. One is this intrinsic value approach, which basically says that nature has value in and of itself. Doesn't matter what it does for people or not for people. There's value in itself, right? So then there's the other approach, which I call the instrumental value approach, which basically says, no, the reason why we would conserve nature is because of what it does for us, right? So this is kind of enlightened self-interest, that we would preserve nature because if we don't, we're going to be harmed. Right? So there's it's a different philosophy underlying these two things. One is sort of more of an ethical or moral argument that says, well, look, we have an obligation to protect nature. We don't have the right to have nature be harmed or to cause extinction of species. The other says, well, if a species doesn't do any good for us, well, maybe we'll just let it go. If there are other things that are more important. But mostly, though, that kind of instrumental value is also saying there are things which are incredibly important that nature does, and so it's in our own self-interest to make sure that we preserve those essential ecosystem functions, the life support system. In terms of results, I really care about what happens in the end. And you can tell me a story about why you did something, and you can tell me two very different stories about why you did something. So I work a lot with the Nature Conservancy. Some people give to the Nature Conservancy because they're really motivated by this sort of moral argument that we don't want to cause extinction of species. Other people are motivated by saying, I care about my backyard, and I care about my backyard maybe because I want it to look a certain way. It's the way I grew up with, and I want to maintain that. Or I care about it because, if we don't protect the drinking water supply from our town, that's going to have consequences. I mean, you can do, in the end, the same thing of protecting a particular place based on protecting the water supply or protecting a species and preventing harm to that species. So when I was saying, I look more to the result, a lot of people can end up at the same place, maybe coming from different reasons in the beginning. But in the end, I want to know, well, what actually happened? I mean, did you preserve that place or not? And what are the consequences if you don't preserve it? So that was my comment about, there was different schools of thought motivating it, but in the end of the day, it's like, well, what happened? Part of this move, and in fact, part of this move was to ecosystem services, was really on the part of the conservation community, where they realized we're not connecting with the public because we're talking about biodiversity. The public says biodiversity, what's that to us? And so this move to ecosystem services is really saying, no, this really does connect to your well-being, right? This is value to people. So in a way, it's really trying to get at that communication and talk right to the public. Most people understand the connection of, if I do something upstream and I put more stuff in the water upstream, that's going to affect the water quality downstream. And if I live downstream, I ought to care about that, or I will care about that. I go to the lake, I care about fishing, I care about swimming in the lake and seeing my toes beyond 2 inches. So all these things that actually you connect back more directly to people, and I think that's really what, at its best, that's what ecosystem services is about, and communicating. The term itself, ecosystem services, is a horrible term. I mean, so if we're talking about communication, ecosystem services is, it's much better to be concrete and specific. Let's talk about the water quality at the lake where you have your summer cottage. Let's talk about what the community looks like. What's the, how are the parks? What are the recreational opportunities? What's the air quality? Can you breathe in the summer? Or are there, periods of air quality alerts? What about the deer or other species that people hunt or that they want to see? Are there declining bird populations that they want to watch? So there are a lot of things that people care about directly. And so, finding basically what this agenda is about is what is it that people really care about, and how can we show what the set of consequences of our actions are having on those things that people care about. So I think it can be done, the communication can be done in ways that are hit people and make it clear. But ecosystem services itself is just, I mean, that's a classic science speak that's not going to communicate well. So the Natural Capital Project, it's formally is a partnership between two academic institutions, so to try to get the best science and get research and figure out, what is, if we do something to ecosystems, how does that play out in terms of what changes in terms of the services provided and the values of those services. But it's also a partnership between two big conservation organizations. So on the academic side, you've got Stanford in Minnesota. On the conservation organization side, you've got the Nature Conservancy and World Wildlife Fund. And the reason for this is really a partnership of science and implementation on the ground. So the Nature Conservancy and WWF have a lot of people who work in particular ecosystems, work with landowners, work with policymakers to try to get things to happen on the ground. So, it's kind of a marriage of trying to get the best science and the academics connected to people who think about how to make change happen on the ground with those NGOs. Some of this could be done. Those are the formal partners. But as I mentioned, TNC now works with Dow. There are other partnerships between the kind of environmental organizations and corporations or environmental organizations and governments to try to think about how would we make bigger scale changes rather than just like a little project here or there, which is more on the order of what certainly an academic or an academic NGO partnership basically could do. But how would you make kind of system-wide changes? And for that, you need many more partners than just what's in the Natural Capital Project itself.